With me in studio this morning is Michal Chatuel from Forum Dvorah, Women in Politics and National Security. Michal, thank you for staying with us. And member of Knesset Tamar Zandberg from Meretz, thank you for staying with us. And of course, the former Deputy Foreign Minister and the former Israeli Ambassador to the United States, Danny Ayalon, thank you. I want to go quickly to Jonathan Sacerdoti, our i24 news correspondent in London. Jonathan, we just saw, of course, a report about how the Israeli Air Force does try to surgically target military targets, Hamas targets within the Gaza Strip. That, of course, is not always available and accessible. There are, of course, civilian deaths, as we've heard. What in the streets of London we've seen since the beginning of the operation, unprecedented numbers, I would say, more than other operations. We saw over weekend at 10 Downing Street, thousands coming to the streets. Would you say this is unprecedented, or is this the same as every operation?
It's hard to know the official numbers, but during previous operations, there were similarly large marches. They usually follow the same route from Downing Street to Kensington, where the Israeli embassy is. And of course, in tandem with that, smaller numbers, but respectable crowds usually gather, as they will do today, between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. outside the Israeli embassy in Kensington in order to show their support for Israel. And you get these sort of contrasting protests, but by far the largest are the ones that are anti-Israel and that are against the operations happening over there in the Gaza Strip, regardless of what you just saw in the report there of the surgical strikes that the Air Force are trying to involve themselves in. There are civilian casualties, as we know, and those images make it out. Sometimes extra images from elsewhere in the Middle East make it out as well, claiming to be from Gaza, or images from previous operations there. But these images are very strong. Their power is enormous, and people here see that on the news and feel that the situation is obviously far more cut and dried than it really is. And that's how these protests gather such strength.
Right.
Of course, the protest in Paris over the weekend, yesterday, was one that was previously banned after the violence that broke out from last Sunday's protest, where Jews were barricaded into synagogues by violent crowds. And again, we saw yesterday, despite the ban put in place by the government on the anti-Israel protesters taking to the streets, they did defy those orders, setting fire to things on the street to form a barricade, and violence again ensued on the streets of Paris. These images are very scary for the Jewish community and for other minority communities within European cities, who see that the police aren't managing to control the violence. And then when they go anywhere near the protests, they can hear outright anti-Semitic chants, Nazi chants, and banners which don't just call for an end to certain Israeli military operations, but call for an end to the state of Israel itself. These sorts of things are now mainstream in those protests. And I think the problem here is not one for Israel, but one for Europe itself, because if it can't control the violence and the anti-Semitism that bubbles under from these sorts of protests, then Jews within Europe will be fleeing, as we've seen from France. The largest number of Jews to leave France has been taking place since the beginning of this year, obviously out of fear for their existence in that country.
And in terms of the British media, for example, we did see last week Jon Snow of Channel 4 having a very almost, you can't say one-sided interview with Mark Regev, the Israeli Prime Minister's spokesperson. At the other hand, we do see BBC being attacked by the public, saying it's too much pro-Israel. What has been your assessment of the media coverage during Operation Protective Edge? And you can compare it, of course, to Operation Cast Lead, which was very clear where the British media was standing.
Jon Snow's unprofessional attitude towards interviews with Israeli officials, especially Mark Regev, with whom he has, let's say, form, is easy to dismiss because it's so regularly seen whenever there's an operation in Israel. But that is a mistake if we do that, because it ought to be registered that a publicly funded station like Channel 4 is putting out what is essentially a propaganda interview against one side. His abrupt, aggressive questions to Mr. Regev and his non-permission for him to answer, cutting him off constantly, really demonstrates, I think, part of the problem in the media coverage here. Often, it seems, if you follow matters in the Middle East, from the sources, the papers, the channels based there, what we're seeing on the news here is often a completely different situation and a completely different war. The protests outside the BBC for bias against the Palestinian cause also surprised many. The BBC is often accused on both sides of having bias the other way. But just for example, on the Today programme on BBC Radio 4, the flagship current affairs news programme listened to by much of the Westminster set and most of our politicians every morning, carried an interview only days before that protest with a Lebanese-American professor from a university here discussing whether or not Hamas was actually a terrorist organization at all. Needless to say, they didn't see fit to actually challenge any of the views during that interview that suggested that maybe it wasn't a terrorist organization. So when there is coverage like this on the BBC, on Channel 4, on these publicly funded stations, I think many people who follow Israel very closely find it very strange to think that there are those who believe that the Palestinian cause isn't represented. Just for example, the BBC has actually flown out so many journalists to Israel and Gaza right now. They hugely outnumber the number of journalists it has in Iraq, in Syria, elsewhere in the region. There must be something like 6 or 7 BBC journalists stationed in various parts of Israel and Gaza right now, at the most senior level of journalism, all covering this current military operation, which is most peculiar when we think what's going on elsewhere in the rest of the Middle East.
Jonathan Sacerdoti, our i24 news correspondent there in London. Thank you for that update. Member of Knesset Zandberg, we do see, of course, the protests on the street, almost every operation, but there is, as John